Almost all here. I know Cristiano is going to join us in a moment. There he
I
is.
open I open I open Zoom into I mean
All right, we are on air, friends. So I believe, Alan, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off. Here we go.
Welcome, everyone. I am Alan Webb. I'm a member of the Climate Change Working Group at Western Michigan University, one of the sponsors of the Climate Migration Symposium, which we're very excited about. And we have such terrific speakers from uh, government agencies and nonprofits and academia and activists and lawyers and so forth that are all making a big impact on this enormous problem, which is only going to grow, which is why it's so important that we have this symposium and we have a rich discussion among all of us about how to address this problem. Of course, there's not only this session, but there are sessions that have longer conversations about what's happened in the symposium itself, and you're welcome to join those. With me during today's session, which is titled "Managing Disaster Displacement," running now until 4 o'clock. There are four terrific speakers who I will introduce one at a time as they each give their talk, and they'll have 15 to 18 minutes to share their thinking with us. And then you can, down below, you'll see the Q&A button. You can click on that and you can add questions or thoughts in there for question and answer session that we'll have when everyone's done making their initial presentation. There isn't a real chat function that works in this webinar format, so we use the Q&A to share that information. So gather your questions, put them there, and we'll return to them. I'd like to go ahead and begin, and I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Andrea Simonelli. She is an associate professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University and founder of Adaptation Strategies International. She's a member and expert consultant for several climate groups and organizations, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Her research investigates the global governance implications of climate mobilities. Her talk emerges from her examination of governance and local resilience in the Maldives and Pacific Island states. Her talk is titled Supporting Climate Migrants, Lessons from the Small Island Developing States. So Andrea, feel free to begin your comments, and if you would like to share a screen, you're invited to do so.
Wonderful. Let's see if I can get this up and running. There we go. I think.
We can see all of your slides if you wanted to be screen sharing the full screen.
Oh, that's
Just
what I
hit
was
the
trying to do.
little podium at the bottom there. If you look across where it says comments, yeah.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. I'm excited to be here to do this. I think that when I saw the call for this symposium and the background, I really gave some thought to the idea of supporting climate migrants and reflecting on the ways in which we do this more specifically. So in thinking of the ways I thought I came into this as an academic researcher 15 years ago, to what I've learned in the field, to how to put that into practice, that supporting climate migrants, I think, looked very different as a student and as someone who is an eager young researcher than it does now, for different and specific reasons. So this talk comes from not just that learned experience, but taking sort of a decolonizing lens to this, very specifically because there's so much of this that you don't know until you know. And a lot of that comes from our own lived experience being in the field. So that's where this is coming from. So for me, supporting climate migrants comes in many forms, and administrative solutions tend to focus on what funding can accommodate, and tends to be limited by donor commitments, institutional capacity, and cooperative buy-in. Often when we're thinking through, from the governance policy angle of what should be done, what can be done, it's managerial, it's what someone thinks is a good idea at the time, might not always pan out that way. What supports do exist? Can we fund them? And how this eventually plays out. But a lot of this is crafted by outsiders, as I myself am not, and I'm not an inhabitant of the SIDS. So we're sort of looking in and from the vantage point of the liberal aid paradigm or neoliberal aid paradigm. And so migrants are not a monolith, and the way they think about the world isn't monolithic. So their needs and wants vary as well as their solution preferences. And these may be wildly and vastly different from what those of us in academic circles or policy circles think about, because we're coming at it from a particular idea of how we think of and use the institutions that we interact with. And that may not look the same way. And I should say definitely didn't as I've gone through my career. So basically, as a young researcher, as I said, this talk is a little reflective and reflexive. I wanted to save the world, right? It's just one of those things. You want to do good things. But I never asked the world if it wanted to be saved. So essentially, there were all of these things that I wanted to do when I found out about this issue, but took it from that original academic space, which is global governance, looking at mobilities, slow moving, mired in politics, and unfortunately has been ill-framed by the media and outside interests. So in coming out of graduate school and being excited to try to have a hand and working in the UNFCCC sector, feeling like, okay, this is the globe, like we're here to do this, everyone came ready to go and eager, and sort of realizing that all of these stumbling blocks that keep us from getting things done, I started to interact with the people on the ground or who are negotiating there, and realizing their viewpoint and things looked a bit different from how I had viewed the world, mostly because pretty much all I read in grad school, at least at that point, 15 years ago, were things that scholarship that didn't always spend time in these places, but talked about them, not with them or to them, but at them. And so using the UN and all this paradigm of aid and wanting to help, it sets our sights of how we manage and how we think about managing these things through a very particular lens. So I began to consider, do we understand what we're governing? And I had the wonderful opportunity to pivot out into the Maldives and work on a 3-year project sponsored by the Norwegian Research Council. And popping in, one of my first thoughts was how much different this was from everything I'd read, noting that I did not know yet at the time how many of the scholars I read had never been to the Maldives. And so we get these frames, right, of desperation and need, and not self-reliance and not autonomy. So therefore, pivoting into this, I was so impressed and shocked by what I didn't know. It was a very humbling experience, but not just to be in the Maldives themselves, like here in Malé, but to pivot out to the outer islands, where I spent most of my time doing small interviews over the course of a couple of years and getting to know people and what their lives look like, which was very different than my life, but also beautiful in that so many people just enjoyed where they lived and still dealt with all of things that we would in our lives. If you notice the young woman on her phone in the lower right corner, I mean, most of the kids had better phones than I did, and I was just like, I'm clearly behind. But more so in speaking to people about the types of issues that I encountered at the top level in these larger meetings, asking about moving, if they wanted to move, what they've heard about it, their interpretations of migration and environmental issues. Most of them had no idea any of this was a problem. The most humbling thing was to realize that the people at the center of so many policy debates, most had no idea that they were that popular, I guess, for lack of a better way to discuss it, that they had no intention of going anywhere, and why would they? And if they did, then I guess they'd go somewhere nearby. It was something that hadn't been thought through. And so to a certain extent, when we center potential migrants, because they haven't left yet, right? And from areas that we know are geographically and geologically, interesting based on where, climate patterns hit and whatnot. we're assuming something about their lives and an urgency sometimes that we don't actually know about. But we're trying to put that on to someone who may very well not consider their world in that way. And I think more than anything, having the responses that I saw of folks who were very perplexed at why I was there to ask any of these questions became very shocking from the vantage point of already being in that conversation for a couple of years and feeling like, yes, I'm doing the good work. And then thinking, oh, wait, I have no idea what I'm doing, apparently. And it's humbling, but it's also very good to do this to learn. So after a couple of years of this, making a pivot into the Greater Pacific, because I assumed there would be much more of the same, but it probably wouldn't look identical. So how to understand that? So having the wonderful experience to pivot into the Marshall Islands and Tuvalu and Kiribati and Fiji and Vanuatu, and to really have a chance to live and spend a lot more time provided to me a much better sense of understanding where people are coming from, what they want of their lives, because I was asking and because I was listening to try to have a better sense of this, to figure out what are we governing? Are we even barking up the right tree? So of the things that to me play out as some of the most important toward considering how do we support those who might be potentially or needing to migrate at some point over things that are obviously well out of their control. The neo-colonial urge to manage others is real. And I think while it comes from a good place of good intention, that doesn't mean that it's the right way to go about things. And so maybe it's not sort of taking the lead to manage others, it's seeing what they understand about the world to understand what they actually want, and more so what other adaptations in place they're already doing. So assuming I know more about where people should be than they do really starts to be sort of neo-colonial in that way. Islanders already live a much less carbon intensive life than the rest of us do. So while there's a lot of green transition to take a moral authority, it's not a necessity. And so I think taking a look at what autonomous decisions need to be made, it's if that helps them do what they want to do forward, really the green transition is more so on us because it's our carbon that's making more of the difference. But even if none of them do, the sort of finger pointing of, well, to advocate for yourself is to have to do everything perfect. That's not necessarily fair when it doesn't matter day to day, the carbon intensity of their lives. There's so much of a minimum concern as compared to what the rest of our lives look like. And their decisions are not ours to make. And some will choose path forwards that we, as the research community, as policy concerns of those who are in this sort of circle, we may disagree with or perceive as mistakes, because it's not our decision to make of where the forward movement is. So originally, when Tuvalu started mining a lot of sand to elevate part of Funafuti, there was a bit of a pushback of, that's a lot of money. Why would they need to do that? They should just go somewhere else. This is their choice to maintain something that is incredibly emotional and important to them. So as the outside community, supporting that is going to be more valuable than trying to assume we know better or that we know enough about what is being lost. Because most of us have never lived in a way that we realize will absolutely and 100% disappear and will not be able to rebuild in these types of ways. So it's also understanding what's important about the emotional loss that comes with your culture being attached to place. Partly to consider is minimizing projection. I think the Western developed lives, our Western developed lives, look very different from the lives of most people who live in the SIDS. I mean, there's some parallels, and technology and the internet's everywhere and plenty of things, run on tap cards and whatnot, but that the day-to-day is different. We shuffle, we hustle, there's a lot more going on. And so what we project as our anxiety and our concerns about how things should be may not be interpreted the same way. Because from the vantage point of having asked many people, the intensity of climate change as an existential threat doesn't run as a thread through so many people's lives the way that it does when we center on it. So what becomes important is school for your children. This I heard more than anything else. I want options for my kids. I need better health care. Most of the concerns in so many of these places end up being development related and having access to basics, not necessarily from the standpoint of being scared for their immediate future. Our lifestyle also made this mess. So part of the projection is sort of taking that mirror and looking back and saying that we might need to start fixing ourselves first versus assuming they have to jump and act on what we have done. And our anxieties are not their anxieties. So it's not just the day-to-day concern of, oh my gosh, climate, but the short-term outlook and long-term outlooks for many people just look very different based on their basic needs. So finally, learning about their lives, struggles, desires in a way to rethink our own biases. So what do people want for their lives? To a certain extent, we don't really know until we ask them. This isn't a monolith. There's a lot of variation across islands in terms of not just who they are and what's important to them, but what they want to see for the future. To a certain extent, depending on where you are, this can just be as simple as I mentioned before. It's sending your kids to school, making sure that you have everything you need. There's not the clamor necessarily for movement, let alone trying to be Western in all of the ways that I think there's this sort of anxiety from the West about, oh, everyone wants to be you, and not really so much. And the communities of a fairly large size between Australia and New Zealand of Pacifica tends to be much more closely related. People don't scatter, they go with their communities anyway. So what people want for their lives is still a sense of connection to a certain extent that they wouldn't get scattering anyway. So that sort of anxiety of how we feel about it or where the urgency sometimes comes from is not super useful. We need to also be considering the grief of cultural loss. So much of this is beyond our comprehension when our day-to-day lives won't be lost. Very few things about those of us with the privilege to be in these circles are going to go away in the way they will for those who are on the fringes like this. So what can we learn from other ways of being and doing? That's something we need to be thinking about. What is it that they're doing that becomes valuable that we would understand as to make an attachment ourselves? Plus, development, at least the way that we talk about it in sort of academic circles, suggests sort of a uniform linear trajectory, but this isn't always a given. Not everyone has to develop into the place where we all are now. That I would hate to assume that there should be a data center, for example, sitting on one of these small islands is another way to help build. We don't need to all go the same direction. So in thinking about what development looks like in these contexts, it doesn't have to look like the way we would do it. So learning what's important and how to support the pivot in terms of what is necessary and what people are looking for, which might not be out migration because for most of the SIDS, avoiding, or I should say, resisting mobility seems to be more on top of their concern level. So finally, I think to know and respect these places is to also have a stake in their future existence, which is incredibly important. I think I've been so privileged and lucky to have had the ability to spend so much time over the last 6, 8 years now across the Pacific and at least the last 12, pretty much bouncing and living between islands to appreciate the identity, the changes, the difference among culture, and to know that writing off their existence to say, well, 1.5, we tried, is extremely short-sighted and offensive. But in that, right, that comes that edge of, well, we just want to manage, how do we just deal with this? Well, the problem possibly comes up from the assumptions and biases that guide our research, and asking what those may be would be helpful. I think I started in all of this with the assumption that this is a problem that I somehow had the gall to want to solve before I really understood a lot of complexity. And so there are assumptions and there are biases we bring to this, whether we like it or not. And it makes it difficult to try to put on a different hat or to be humble enough to always be learning ourselves so that we can not speak for, but with and help bring ideas to fruition that actually benefit people that are not just for ourselves. And also rejecting the frames that elevate migration as an outside threat will better help guide our action and research. That it isn't a problem to solve if we had already solved our development problem in the first place. If we weren't developing in this way and consistently adding to the problem and making it worse through all kinds of this new tech that we have no control over where it's going now, we wouldn't be looking at this as a threat. It's a threat to how things are now, but it's more a threat to what people live day to day in places where they had no say in how this was going and don't even use the technology that is destroying their futures. So I want to thank you for having me with a little bit of reflection and reflexivity, and all trying to, I think, take a step back to attempt more than anything to be really cognizant of not just trying to be helpful, but how we best do that so that we are able to minimize sort of the um, bad things happening out of good intentions. So thank you.
Andrea, thank you for those very insightful comments, well earned by your own story, which I appreciate your framing this with. And it's going to give us all something to think about as we continue this panel and as we continue our work in general. Um, I think I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker now. This is going to be Carol Fernandez Herrera. She's a senior researcher at La Ruta del Clima, a Costa Rican-based NGO addressing climate change and its impacts. Um, Drawing on qualitative and participatory research, she works on climate change and human mobility and populations facing vulnerability and/or social inequality and gender gaps. She'll speak today about a costing tool created by International Organization for Migration, IOM, with the technical support of La Ruta del Clima, designed to support local governments in accessing funds, mobilizing resources, and planning regarding human mobility and climate change in order to ensure that the right to human mobility is exercised in a safe, dignified, and comprehensive manner. Her talk today draws on the lessons learned and the needs identified regarding the capacities of local national governments and recommendations for implementing planned relocations and supporting displaced persons. Her talk is titled Climate Justice and Governance, Two Pathways to Address Human Mobility in the Context of Climate Change. So thank you very much, Carol, and looking forward to hear from you.
Okay. Okay. One moment, please. Okay. First of all, hello everyone. I am so happy to be here. Um, Before I start, I have to say that English is not my first language, so I may speak slowly, and I will do my best to be clear. And if something is not clear, please let me know, and I will repeat. Also, I am going to read because it is easier for me. So, well, nice to meet you. I'm Carol Fernandez from La Ruta del Clima. We work with communities facing climate risk and human mobility, people who move, people who stay, and people who cannot move. Today, I will share what we do, what we're learning, and what must change. So, La Ruta del Clima is an ONG that promotes climate justice and public participation. We listen to communities document climate impacts, both economic and non-economics, and also co-design solutions with local actors and governments. We focus on human mobility in the context of climate change and on the rights and dignity of people. we have three focus areas in the work that we do in the organization: research, projects, and advocacy and communication. So today I will cover 3 points. One, what human mobility means in the climate context. 2, what climate justice lens matter to talk about human mobility in the climate change context. And 3, how governance and public policy can respond fairly and effectively. So on the organization, in the Ruta del Clima, we believe that human mobility is how people move because of different pressures and choice. Climate change can be one of those pressures. Mobility can be temporary or permanent, nervy or across borders, voluntary or forced. It includes migration, displacements, planet relocations, and even immobility. In our work in different communities, we see clear impacts that shape mobility decisions. For example, we work in Manzanillo. This is a community in the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. And in this community, women reported headache during heat waves. And at the same time, they lead mangrove restoration and environmental education programs like a form to stay in their communities. Also in Cedeño, in Honduras, in the Golfo de Fonseca, the sea level rise and the coastal erosions produce damage in homes and in the work of the people. And many people see migration as a survival strategy. And those who stay in the community, often women, children, and older adults, carry more care work and face more economic pressures. These stories show that climate impacts change health, income, care, work, and community roles. Mobility is both a risk and a strategy to survive. Adaptation can reduce forced movement. With the International Organization of Migrations, we support communities in Puerto Jiménez, Los Chiles, and Caldera. These 3 communities are in Costa Rica. We work to design local adaptations plans. We use participatory methods to identify threats and co-create actions to fit each place on water, health, agriculture, and timely climate information. We believe that adaptation in rights-based and context-sensitive, it helps people remain safely by reducing risk. Mobility should be safe, dignified, and a right, not only a last resort. Adaptation and support can expand choices. Why climate justice matters when we talk about human climate mobility? Well, climate justice means climate change is not only about temperature. It is about power, inequality, and responsibility. Some actors, especially high-emitting countries and big corporations, cause more of the crisis. Many communities contribute the less but face the worst impacts. What justice looks like in the practice. For mobility, climate justice means protect rights of people on the move and people who stay, prevent the harm, invest in adaptation and risk reduction so movement is a choice, not only a necessity. Repair harm. When people lose homes, health, culture, or income, they need reparations, not only emergency aid. Think beyond money. Damage are economic. and not economic. Both matters. Transform systems, address roots of the crisis. Extractivism, colonial legalism, gender inequalities, racism, and border violence. Some examples of just responses are planned relocation with dignity. If relocation it is necessary, it must improve safety and quality of life, ensure service and livelihoods, and keep community ties. Compensation programs support families who lost income, assets, or cultural spaces. Safe routes and protections, reduce risks on the movement, and prevent rights violations. Support for those who cannot move, recognize and access in mobility population. Climate justice connects preventions, protections, and reparations, centering on people's rights and voices. What we learned working with local governments. In Los Chiles, Caldera, and Puerto Jiménez, we brought communities and municipalities together to map threats, design local strategies, and identify institutional gaps. Community leaderships creates real opportunities. With the IMG, we support communities to design local adaptations plans, and we co-develop a costing tool for climate-related human mobility. This tool calculates and makes visible both economic and not economical losses linked to displacement and planned relocations. It guides budgets, programs design, and access to finances. What makes this tool different is the integral lens. It looks beyond infrastructure to include mental health support, stress, anxiety, grief, and trauma linked to climate impacts and mobility, education continually, safe schools, transports, materials, and support for students and teachers affected by displacements or relocation, reparations and recovery, not only emergency aid, but compensation, rehabilitation, and support to rebuild livelihoods and social networks. Healing of territories no longer habitable. When communities must live, we work on ecological and social healing, for example, memorializing places, preserving culture, identity, and planning relocation with dignity, so people can keep community ties and history. If we measure what truly matters, health, education, culture, identity, governments and donors can fund what community really needs to reduce forced displacements and ensure dignified mobility. For practical tools for fair claim policies become more just when they include: one, community partnerships, real participation for day one; two, equitative advisor boards, community members and multi-sector actors getting planning and follow-up; three, equitative tools, checklists, and frameworks to integrate justice in every decision; four, justice indicators, track who benefits, who is left out, and whether policies reduce inequality. What governments and donors can do now? Well, fund community design, adaptation that reduce forced displacements, create protocols for safe, voluntary, and dignified mobility, including planned relocation, budgets for non-economic losses, health, culture, identity, care borders, ensure gender-responsive approaches, recognize and reduce care work and gender risk, build data systems with community monitoring to inform action and measure justice. Government is not only technical, it is a collective practice of care that must redistribute power and ensure rights. At La Ruta del Clima, we believe people should have the right to stay safely, the right to move safely, and the right to return if they wish. Policies must listen to community, address roots, causes, and repair harms. We invite partners, governments, donors, researchers, and community to co-design solutions. Let's turn climate justice from a slogan into a practice. Protect right, expand choice, and build dignified futures together. That's it. Thank you.
That was a terrific presentation and a very nice follow-up to our first talk. And we'll have an opportunity again, if you'd like to put questions into the Q&A, we'll be able to follow up on that when all the speakers have finished. Our next speaker will be Cristiano Dorsey. He is a lecturer and senior research fellow at the Faculty of Law at the University of Johannesburg, and a senior consultant in asylum and human rights law in Africa, and expert witness in London. His research focuses on international law, African refugee law, migration law, and human rights. In July of this year, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, which is comprised of 16 countries, including over 400 million people in the southern region of Africa, established a regional program on forced displacement, fragility mitigation, and climate resilience. This program, rooted in humanitarian development peace nexus, prioritizes information management, resource mobilization, and the inclusion of displaced people in national development plans to support self-reliance. Dr. Dorsey's talk today will examine this effort, and it's titled Assessing the Recent Developments in Protecting Climate Displaced Persons in the SADC area.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsey.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Webb. Thank you for the invite. Yes, I'm an expert of Africa, so my presentation reflect my interest. I don't want to say my expertise, but it's really my interest. It's really my passion as well. I would like to start saying that in 2006, the African Union adopted the Migration Policy Framework for Africa, the MPFA, in order to explore ways to address migration issues and harness the benefits of migration for development in Africa, of course. The MPFA focuses on 9 thematic areas. Among them, I can cite labor migration, border management, irregular migration, forced displacement, the human rights of migrants, internal migration, migration data, migration and development, and interstate cooperation and partnership. Other cross-cutting issues related to migration include health, the environment, gender, and also conflict. While considering the dynamics of migration and constant changes in trend and patterns, the EU Commission, based on recommendation from the various regional economic communities, update the MPFA, and it formulated a plan of action for its implementation in 2016. This effort resulted in the revised MPFA and plan of action 2018-2030. The revised framework, unlike its predecessor, covers 8 key areas. There's migration governance, labor migration and education, diaspora engagement, border governance, irregular migration, forced displacement, internal migration, and migration and trade. Under each area, the framework makes policy recommendations for countries to adopt, in fact. as I mentioned, as you could understand, climate change is not a crucial thematic area of the MPFA, but is recognized as a cross-cutting issue. The MPFA highlights the relationship between migration and the environment, noting that climate change is one of the major factors for migration and mobility on the continent. And the framework provides strategies by which state parties could address this link, including integrating environmental consideration in existing domestic migration policies and addressing environmental degradation to minimize displacement. The framework also recognized that migration is a multifaceted phenomenon, of course, that demands the action of different stakeholders at national and regional levels. However, the framework lacks concrete, practical proposition on how to attain the desired goals or who bear specific obligations or responsibilities, and on the question of by when the goals should be concretely achieved. Uh, Against this backdrop, the Southern African Development Community, the SADC, has attempted to enable cross-border movement of people through the Protocol on Facilitation of Movement of Persons, the so-called Facilitation Protocol, that was first adopted in 2005. The latter aims to ensure the movement of people in three phases: entry, residence and establishment, and controls at the border. Regarding the first phase, Article 14 of the protocol prescribes that the citizen of a state party that wishes to enter the territory of another state party as a visitor shall be admitted without a visa. This visa-free admission is to be granted on the condition that the visit is for a maximum of 90 days. The visitor has a travel document, proof of financial support, and is not prohibited person. An entry is sought through an official port of entry. However, to date, this protocol has been ratified only by 4 out of 16 SADC countries, namely Botswana, Eswatini, Mozambique, and South Africa. And this is falling short of the 2/3 of the member states required for its enforceability. This prolonged status quo of enforceability highlights the right to free movement is hardly embraced and protected really in the region. And the same South Africa, for example, although finally ratified this protocol, he's reserving to use different measures to limit the entry of the citizens of other SADC countries. In this scenario, however, a bit more than 3 months ago, on the 25th June 2025, the SADC has taken a decisive step toward confronting the region escalating humanitarian and climate crisis by hosting the first ever joint ministerial meeting on forced displacement, fragility mitigation, and climate resilience. The meeting brought together ministers responsible for disaster risk management, climate change, and the organ on politics, defense, and security cooperation. The event has been considered a brave commitment to addressing SADC most tenacious and interconnecting challenges through unified regional action. During the meeting, the SADC Executive Secretary highlighted the intersecting nature of this crisis, noting the need for integrated, evidence-based solutions, reinforcing the imperative of cross-sectorial coordination, agile financing, and stronger data system. To address these challenges, SADC ministers endorsed the establishment of a regional program on forced displacement, fragility mitigation, and climate resilience. This initiative will be rooted in the humanitarian development peace nexus and prioritize information management and data system, resource mobilization, including engagement with climate finance and the private sector, as well as the establishing a shared regional framework to guide donor and partner coordination and to promote the inclusion of displaced people in national development plans to support self-reliance. That is something very interesting, in fact. The meeting also acknowledged the shifting global financing landscape and identified the multilateral development banks coordination platform on forced displacement as a key opportunity for mobilizing resources. This inaugural joint ministerial meeting reflects a renewed commitment by SADC to protect its people, sustain development gains, and build long-term resilience in the face of evolving regional and global shocks. In this scenario, trading, migration, and ecological functioning are all likely to be affected by the impacts of climate change. For example, crop-growing areas and market requirements will change, providing both risks and opportunities for the import and export of crops within SADC. Environmentally induced, because of crop failures, of course, migration patterns are likely to be exacerbated with subsequent impacts on resource allocation, settlement, and health. While there are substantial uncertainties regarding vegetation projections in SADC, biomes are predicted to shift considerably under future climate. As biomes shift, ecosystem functioning may not be able to support traditional rural livelihood strategies and dependent population on that, in fact. In this scenario, in response, in fact, of this meeting, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, applauded it, maintaining that the developments seen at the meeting demonstrate that SADC is a regional leader in delivering pioneering, sustainable, integrated responses to forced displacement. This particularly is the number of families who had to flee their homes across the sub-region continued to grow, driven by conflict, climate impacts, and socioeconomic fragility. SADC member states have a long-standing history of generously hosting refugees, and UNHCR commends this continued commitment to provide protection and support to displaced people. The newly endorsed regional program seeks to build on these efforts by delivering coordinated and sustainable responses that will help refugees and displaced families and the host communities thrive. According to the UNHCR, the regional program adopted at the meeting on the 25th of June is a tangible example of the Global Compact on Refugees in action and reflects the continued commitment of SADC member states to deliver on the pledges made at the global refugee forums, in effect. I would like to provide, as you can see from my overview, now the case of a specific community in SADC area, the Entendroy people in Madagascar. Between 2018 and 2024, about 90,000 people from southern Madagascar, mostly the Entendroy, were forced to leave their ancestral lands due to drought-induced famine. Drought-induced displacement in southern Madagascar are deeply rooted in the French colonial era, which introduced cochineal parasites to eradicate the Opuntia monacantha, that is a drought-resilient cactus growing in the region. This policy contributed to the vulnerability of the Entendroy people to droughts, which the government of Madagascar and scientists have in recent years linked to global climate change. More recently, the effects of climate change have made droughts more severe, leading to displacement towards the Berni region in North Madagascar and other parts of the country. Madagascar's contribution to global carbon emission, in fact, is very negligible. Yet, the Antandroid people find themselves bearing the brunt of a crisis created in part by the action of high-income historical emitting countries and French colonial rule. To understand the plight of those displaced, Amnesty International very recently visited 6 villages of Antandroy IDPs and the main arrival bus station. In total, Amnesty International interviewed 122 IDPs, Antandroy IDPs, and also consulted government officials, local and international organizations, academic climate scientists, and analyzed satellite imagery. The government responded to Amnesty International, underscoring effort to improve drought resilience in southern Madagascar. It also explained that plans for a local displacement management strategy have been delayed, partly due to limited logistical and financial resources. The response, however, failed to address France's responsibility dating back to the French colonial period, the 2021 forced eviction, or the inadequacy of the 2023 pilot resettlement site. I would like making on that a political note, as you may have followed very recently, no more than a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I remember, there was a coup in Madagascar who detronized the president in charge. And at the moment, we have in Madagascar a military junta who, as it happened also in other countries in Africa, former French colonies like Niger and Chad and Burkina Faso and Mali, this military junta is trying to detach the country from France. So we are very curious to see the development also in the framework of this displacement because of climate change. And to conclude, Southern Africa has for decades demonstrated the spirit of Ubuntu, that by generously hosting people are forced to flee their homes due to violence and persecution. Natural disaster, drought, and flooding have only compounded the challenges that the refugees and their communities in which they live are facing. Joining together is one way to enhance the standard of quality of life of people of Southern Africa and support the socially disadvantaged through regional cooperation and integration. But probably I'm not sure if I mentioned a word that whose meaning, there is Ubuntu. What is this Ubuntu? That is very, people are very familiar with it in Africa, but I understand that outside Africa is not really a concept very well known. Well, Ubuntu is, let's say, is an African philosophy emphasizing interconnectedness, compassion, and community, often summarized by the phrase, I am because we are. Ubuntu highlights that the personal identity and humanity are shaped by their relationship with others. It promotes values like mutual respect, harmony, and collective well-being over extreme individualism. Core principle is a person is a person because of or through the others. This means that individual identity is formed and expressed through community and relationship. Let's say, to be coincide, we can consider it a sort of socialism, spiritual socialism. In Southern Africa, SADC, the African Development Bank, and UNHCR are all working together to address the growing number of forced displacement and the impact of extreme weather and natural hazards across the continent. By adopting a nexus approach to addressing issues of forced displacement, fragility mitigation, and climate resilience, given the interrelatedness of these issues and the need for holistic regional approaches and solutions. This partnership lays emphasis on incorporating displacement issue into long-term development and disaster response efforts at both the regional and national level to create stronger and more resilient communities. The SADC Executive Secretary, Honorable Excellencies Magosi, has recently emphasized the need for shared responsibility between UNHCR and SADC countries in addressing issues of displacement and refugees. Mr. Magosi further observed that the Memorandum of Understanding between UNHCR and SADC, signed in July 2019, offers a sound framework for strengthened collaboration between the two institutions. This in order to jointly address regional challenges. The MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, provides for cooperation in promoting the implementation of the UN General Assembly resolutions, including the Global Compact on Refugees, promoting the objective of the Global Action Plan to end statelessness and accession to international and African continental instruments related to refugees, stateless persons, and IDPs persons, and promoting the management of mixed migratory movements within and into the SADC region. I'm practically done. Regarding climate change, UNHCR is increasingly focused on adapting the program partnership and capacity to prepare for climate change implications by strategically working with other stakeholders to anticipate for and mitigate the vulnerability and needs being multiplied by conflict and climate change together. Thank you very much. Sorry if I've been a bit long.
Thank you, Cristiano. You're just a few seconds long. Don't worry about that. But thank you for helping us think about regional collaboration, which seems important in all these contexts. So again, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. And I'd like to introduce our final speaker, and then after her, we'll open it up to a more general conversation. Our last speaker is Michelle Layton. She's an expert in migration, environmental, humanitarian, and human rights law. And she has 30 years experience providing advice to international agencies, UN treaty bodies, governments, and NGOs. Recently, she served as a consultant to the World Bank on its World Development Report on Migration for Africa, and as a fellow for the Global Climate Center on Climate Mobility in New York, and advisor to the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. She's currently on the board of the East African Center for Forced Migration and Displacement. She's interested in how collaborative, rights-based approaches can advance shared responsibility and provide practical ethical pathways for climate-displaced people. Her talk will examine international labor standards and emerging international frameworks that advance cooperative responses among states, including Cartagena, the 40-plus roadmap, and the recent ICR and IACHR advisory opinions. Her talk is titled From Crisis to Opportunity, Creating Decent Work Migration Pathways that Recognize Shared Responsibility. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon. And thanks to Paul and the university for bringing us together and organizing this symposium. I'm going to take a regional approach as well. And I've been particularly interested in this space on how we can help migrants and those displaced feel more welcome in communities. In my decade at the ILO, like Andrea, I talked with many migrants about their needs and their frustrations with the way these issues are tackled or not. And I've seen a lot of change in the political landscape. Migration, I think, will continue to be an adaptive strategy for many families. Some of the speakers already talked about that in response to slow onset or rapid onset disasters. But traditional climate planning has tended to view migration as a failure of adaptation. and rather than focusing on it as a response. So many countries right now lack the tools and the policies for human mobility and to plan for that or to have constructive social dialogue. I think this is starting to change. A number of regions are considering how migration can be a positive coping mechanism with practical policies that get to the field level, and that would help their home and host communities. But more often than not, this will involve integration into the labor markets, and that can get somewhat complex, but it certainly is one avenue. And this is because having a decent job is not just important for survival. It brings dignity and purpose rather than a loss of hope and despair. International legal doctrine is also solidifying around state responsibility to protect those displaced. And so in my talk, I just want to step back and reflect on the legal doctrine and some regional approaches for integrating climate-driven migrants more appropriately than we have. And I'll start with the new legal pronouncements and then look at public perception challenges and end with guidance and good practices that I think can help inform public policy and countries who are struggling today. Data indicate that most migration today is about work, not crisis. It's about work. The ILO estimates that about 168 million migrant workers make up 60% of the total migration flows, or that of 284 million migrants globally, and that 90% of these migrants are of working age. So because such a large share of people cross borders, usually legally, because so much of that is labor related, sound migration policy should be considering national labor market needs, looking at shortages, ensuring equal rights in the workplace, matching migrant skills to the right jobs, and extending social protection. But for many countries, including my own, which is the US, the securitization of migration has really taken center stage, and it has overshadowed economic, inclusionary, or any humanitarian benefits. And this creates, I think, a blind spot and missed opportunities for migrants and host communities. In many areas, climate pressures are already affecting livelihoods and pushing people across borders. Whether from storms, floods, sea level rise, drought, land degradation, extreme heat, these are eroding employment in climate-sensitive areas and sectors like agriculture, fisheries, pastoralism, and sectors dependent on low-skilled labor. So when these employment opportunities fail or disappear, people move internally or across borders to search out new opportunities for work. And at the same time, we see many receiving countries closing their borders. And so migrants are finding themselves in irregular channels, which exposes them to labor exploitation, human trafficking, and sometimes forced labor. And importantly, I think for our discussion, the bulk of these international migrants are moving away from disasters from countries that did not cause the climate crisis. And I'll discuss this dynamic just briefly because it reinforces the argument of shared responsibility by big emitting countries and to consider mobility as part of adaptation, not just as emergency relief. So I'd like to turn to the issue of state responsibility. The Global Refugee and Migration Conventions were not designed to anticipate climate displacement that we see today. But these two new advisory opinions people have alluded to are helping to reframe state responsibility. The first is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights advisory opinion from this summer. It framed the climate emergency as a human rights issue. And the court clarified states have legal duties to prevent, mitigate, and remedy climate harms which threaten the enjoyment of multiple human rights and to address human mobility, relocation, and protection. The court emphasized that these obligations to prevent harm and harm to the environment are directly related to their obligations on the right to life, health, culture, and the rights of present and future generations. It indicated that climate-driven migration and displacement are within the scope of those obligations. So states do have a duty to ensure that their climate policies are related to human mobility and displacement, and to cooperate with other states to protect the right to a healthy climate. They can do this through bilateral or regional agreements to protect those forced to move, or it could be through humanitarian protection, residence and work permits, or refugee status. The second decision is that of the International Court of Justice response to the UN General Assembly, also published this summer. In that opinion, the International Court held that states have to consider human rights obligations in addressing climate change, and including to plan for, cooperate, and implement adaptation and mobility responses. And it recognized that environmental deterioration and climate change does or can lead to cross-border mobility, so states have an obligation to include cooperation on technology transfer, finance, and facilitation of human mobility, whether via migration or temporary residence. And it also affirmed that there is a duty to support vulnerable states and to protect and not return migrants at risk of harm under the principles of non-refoulement. So these decisions not only offer clarity, but for the first time, they're bringing together the interdependency of all obligations as they relate to protecting people and the climate system. So they strengthen the legal argument that migration is part of climate justice and state duty and not just a peripheral matter. Now, while these obligations should be informing migration, climate, and policy, in a number of high-emission countries like the United States, the political discourse on immigration is toxic. And it's today too often framed in dehumanizing terms, criminalizing migrants, securitizing the border, rather than welcoming those in need. Now, this contradicts the data and the reality about all the cultural and economic contributions migrants make. In addition to filling our labor shortages and basically upholding whole sectors of work, they bring diverse culture to our communities. And interestingly, in 2022, there's evidence that they paid $579 billion in taxes to the US government. That's 1 in every $6 collected that year. But little attention is paid to these facts. So a real question is, how do we move public attitudes to be more supportive of countries to offer protection for those displaced to migrate? Well, I want to offer just a sliver of hope, a sliver of where I think things are changing. An Ipsos Mori survey conducted this year in 29 countries found that while views are still polarized in many places, 67% of people supported offering refuge to those in need. And they believe wealthier countries have a moral responsibility to assist refugees. A survey in the UK, also taken within the last year, found that 46% of the public is more likely to view the contribution of immigration as positive, compared to 28% who view it negatively. But importantly, that's reversing a trend that started in 2015, where 45% of the people viewed it as negative. So this is a significant reversal. And I think many of us witnessed during those here in the United States, the No Kings rallies across the US cities. Many people were actually taking to the streets, expressing their resentment and being against the inhumane treatment of immigrants. And in one community, mothers were protesting having witnessed their child's favorite teachers being handcuffed and deported. I think these can be powerful stories for ways to change the narrative. But there's also guidance and practice that's happening in spite of the largest emitting countries, where regions are taking on these issues and are showing that there are good practices that really can ensure benefits to communities by opening the doors to migration in labor markets. So these practical guidance and government authorities are implementing really create much more rational and humane policies. And they follow along the UN Global Compact on migration for safe, orderly, and regular migration. So my focus has been on work because the studies show that when migrants work side by side with nationals in the workplace, there is a greater sense of acceptance and there's a decline in social tension. So the workplace is terribly important for integration. And this has informed, these kind of principles have informed ILO's work with governments and business and unions, including recently developing a policy brief on labor migration and just transition, which was launched at COP27. And these draw on already adopted ILO principles on access of refugees to the labor market. What the guidance provides is a sort of roadmap for including displaced populations into host communities and labor markets. And that is through a number of guidelines around decent wages, non-discrimination, social dialogue, and solidarity with national workers. It really provides a foundation for standards-based labor migration pathways for those who are displaced by climate. Another set of guidance is from the Warsaw International Mechanism, the Task Force on Displacement, and we heard one of the people discuss this morning in Atlee's session. The Warsaw International Mechanism was created by the Paris Agreement, and during my term on that task force, we adopted some general guidance, including on labor mobility pathways and the importance of integration. But in the last year, the task force has issued specific guidance on loss and damage. And that incorporates practices on migration, displacement, and planned relocation. But it's really a tool to support government planning or local planning with guidance, including how labor migration pathways could work. Then I want to point to the Cartagena Plus 40 Declaration. The plan of action adopted under that explicitly recognizes forced displacement caused by disasters and the adverse effects of climate change as a matter of regional responsibility. It also affirmed labor market inclusion and rights-based approaches for responding to displaced persons. And I think the region sets a precedent for viewing migration and labor inclusion through a climate lens and through the lens of responsibility. When migration policy is informed by the guidance, or if it's informed by the guidance, we know that it would do a number of things. It would seek to document which sectors and legal pathways exist for migrants to help fill shortages. It would recognize migrant skills and ensure their social protection, and it would diminish precarious work and give migrants longer protection and greater remittances to send home for reducing poverty and helping education and children's health and adaptation. And now we are seeing this rational and humane approach being adopted in some regions. So I want to just give some examples of a few regions, and I was glad to hear, what was going on in South Africa, but I wanted to look at 3 regional processes and how they're working on this. First is in Africa, on the East Africa, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, has a free movement protocol adopted in 2020, which provides a pathway for those forced to migrate due to climate disaster, and it promotes the right to work. The regional authority has been working to examine how to include migration policy in climate and doing specific pilot studies on integration into labor markets. And one lesson is that labor mobility pathways can only be successful if countries really take a look at labor market needs assessment. That helps them identify which sectors of business are suffering labor shortages. And this data is not readily available. So they have to undertake this anew and meet with business and look at different sectors. But it can pay off. IGAD utilized data and social dialogue to target labor market assessments with some very interesting results in markets across Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, and Uganda. So sectors like agriculture, healthcare, manufacturing, construction, green economy infrastructure in some places, and services were the ones most in need. And this helps countries to really match migrant skills to fill labor shortages. And to do that, countries also need to have mechanisms for skills recognition. And many agencies are working with countries now since it's one of the top priorities. The final lesson that has come out of that work is that you have to bring together both nationals and migrants in skills training and in opportunities for getting into the market. And that brings much more solidarity and acceptance. In Latin America, the organization, there's a free movement protocol also adopted by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States that allows citizens and families to move and to access employment on an equal footing with nationals. And this has had tremendous benefits for climate crisis. After Hurricane Maria in 2017, people were able to move to countries and help rebuild areas destroyed where destroyed housing was, infrastructure services, and other areas that really helped those countries come online a lot faster. And some migrants gained skills that they then brought back to their countries and helped in their region build back their communities. They are also looking at mechanisms for skills recognition so they can have a better fit and match with skills that migrants bring and with labor market shortages. And many groups are supporting their efforts to do that. And so that's what they're now moving toward. In the Pacific Islands, they've adopted the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. It sets out a rights-based approach to climate mobility in response to sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, and other climate impacts. And it recognizes that there is a priority for those staying in place and assistance for that, as well as those who want to move across borders or internationally. It also provides mechanisms for regional cooperation and capacity building, technology transfer, and rights protection. And it seeks to integrate the labor mobility and migration policy into national climate adaptation plans. So building that into resilience. Right now, the ILO, IOM, and a number of UN agencies are working with states to implement that framework and developing training for migration and relocation, and helping governments to create pathways for labor mobility where that's appropriate. One of the most important lessons, I think, that has come out of all these regions and the work that we've done, I think, is the need to recognize that men and women migrants have different vulnerabilities and they're distinct. So policies need to reflect that. If a woman is fleeing harm from climate disaster or just fleeing disaster in general, and then is employed in another country as a domestic worker in an abusive household, she leaves one crisis and she enters another. So policies have to start looking at migration patterns and sectors in which vulnerabilities may be distinct between men and women. So that's a lot, but let me say in closing that the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Court advisory opinions underscore that there is state responsibility now. States with the greatest greenhouse gas emissions have to prevent further damage to the climate system and also protect those displaced through national policies, not just on paper, but through national policies. And we do have the tools to make mobility possible and safe, such as through work visas and humanitarian pathways or bilateral partnerships. And we have experiences from different regions on how they're integrating migrants in the labor market and how they're making the discussion and dialogue more positive. So regional communities in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific show us lessons, show the lessons to the world's largest countries, and I think we should listen. So let me end by saying decent work programs that help national workers and migrants can be a powerful unifying force for solidarity and responding to forced migration due to climate change. And I hope we can find ways to focus more on those positive lessons. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Andrea, Carol, and Cristiano for very fine talks from spreading across the world, these issues of climate migration and how they're impacting local people and how people are making decisions about how to act, and how we can have better ways to not only they make decisions about leaving, and we're making decisions about how to accept them. But our talks went from the beginning of the process sort of to the end in a way. We have a number of questions that have come up in the Q&A, but I thought that I'd give a minute to see if the various panel members have any thoughts or responses or questions for fellow panel members, or any observations about the panel. I was pretty struck by Andrea's emphasis on really trying to hear the perspectives um, of people and their decisions about trying to migrate. And I I wondered with some of the policies that Cristiano and Michelle were talking about in different contexts. It seems that those are potentially responsive to the desires and the choices that potential migrants are making. But I wonder how we might formulate policies best to be able to respect the choices of um, endangered peoples. Any thoughts on that? Small question.
I know, small, right? We've come a long way, I think, with the development, as Michelle has pointed out, just the proliferation of this that has come in the last few years, and that's been wonderful. So I think we're moving in that direction to be able to support people better. I think most of the places I tend to work in, there's just a less desire in the first place to go anywhere. So I think we've done better in supporting different mobility pathways than we had to supporting those who don't want to go anywhere. And unfortunately, the immobility piece is still tricky in terms of what that means for long-term aid, commitment to space, what type of EEZ support will be there, all of these different additional problems.
We're certainly seeing a very strong anti-migrant political sentiment in the West, at least, but I think in many places in the world. And that's why I was so appreciative of Michelle's concept of people finding areas where they need immigration and then finding ways for people to work together and to develop a recognition of their common interests, not to mention their common humanity.
I had a quick question, actually on Cristiano's discussion of the platform. I wasn't sure if I understood how the platform will work and whether a lot of governments and experts and others will participate in that kind of platform. I may have misheard, but it sounds like a really interesting dynamic that they're getting underway, if it's getting underway.
Yes, but may I respond or we take more questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Michelle, for your question. Well, in fact, it's it's still a bit in an embryonic status, but mostly there will be country authorities, but there will be in the platform there will be implicated also. I mean, they should be implicated also stakeholders from the major NGOs operating in the sector here in, not here, sorry, I'm not in South Africa at the moment, oh, yeah, sorry, the video. I'm trying to, yes, yeah, the video, okay, let me see. Can you see me? No. I'm trying to, okay, to switch the video on. Okay, cool. No. Sorry, the connection is okay. Now it's fine. No. I was saying that in principle, can you see me now, right? In principle, it should be many stakeholders should be implicated in the process. The truth is that the meeting was only 3 months ago. I mean, a bit more than 3 months ago, and things are getting slowly on. At the moment, for example, the major effort in South Africa are made by the fact that South Africa will host the G20 meeting now in November, I think. So let's say that we still, I mean, they put aside a lot of documents at the moment, a lot of files. They're not the priority, and one is the platform that has been approved, I mean, adopted in June. So we don't have we don't have up to now major developments. Also because, you know, there is always a problem um, with the authorities, the different authorities in the different countries. You know, there are countries in the SADC area that are experiencing a lot of problems, like Mozambique, where the president is, I mean, it's not very stable because of what's happening in Cabo Delgado for 8 years now. Recently, as I mentioned, we experienced the problem, the change of government in Madagascar. So let's say to have an unanimous, you know, an unanimous decision and an unanimous policy, all the countries should have a very stable period, and it's not really the case at the moment for several. But let's say there's a wishful thinking that we hope that with 2026 could be implemented more concretely. Yeah.
Thank you, Cristiano. I'm going to take one of the questions from the audience, and this is directed to you, Carol. The question is, can you give us a brief example of the application of your cost tool? How does it work?
Yes, I am sharing a link to our tool. And well, the tool, it has two modules, one for planet relocation and other for disaster displacement. And the tool includes cost dimensions built from two data exercises. For one, with communities, and the other exercise of the data collection is with national and local governments. This means it can be the tool, it can be used in both contexts, for planet relocation or displacements. Yeah, we, in the process of developing the tool, we pilot the planet relocation model in Caldera in Costa Rica, a community fencing for the coastal erosion. And people need to relocate it because the area is high risk and cannot be mitigated. And for the case of displacement, we applied the displacement model in San Javier, Chile, after wildfires that displaced local residents. This tool helps to estimate costs of a planned relocation process and the costs borne by displaced people. The goal of the tool is to support governments in mobilization resources for fair and effective actions. In the link, you can find like all the documents. Also, you can find the tool and others and the study case and videos of how it works, the tool, and how is that we think that it have to be put in function in for the governments.
Thank you, Carol. Let's see, we've got several other questions here. We have a member of the audience who is an anthropologist, and she's interested in. Let me read her question. I'm seeking ways of making archaeologists and more generally historians' voices louder in conversations like those we're having today, as they have valuable insights based on long-term knowledge of resilience pathways throughout history. How do you think these types of scholars could be more included? I'm not a panelist, but I'm gonna say something about that, which is that number one, they need to start really focusing their work on these questions of climate pathways, and then they can start making connections between the past or the different social contexts and the issues in the present. And I think one of the tricks, if you're that kind of scholar, is to see how your work connects to contemporary context without losing track of the area in which that you're working. I'm not sure that's answering the question or not, but there's Melissa Bondar, who's a member of the audience, and she would like to. Oh, Melissa, wait, I'm trying to. Melissa, you're running our technology,
I
right?
am, yes.
Are you going to answer this question live? It says what?
Oh no, you are answering. You are already chatting.
Oh, I'm answering it.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what that. You sent a little note in there. Now I know what that means. Okay, this is my first panel. I'm sure I can come with a couple more, but I'm getting the hang of it. All right, terrific. Here's a question for you, Michelle. Thanks, everyone. Michelle, you spoke about state responsibility for climate displacement. What can be done when states are themselves fragile or in conflict, like in parts of the Middle East, for example, Yemen? Who carries the responsibility then?
Yes, I mean, I think this is an excellent question. What I really enjoyed, I think, as an international lawyer reading the ICJ's opinion on state responsibility and obligations is that it talked about differentiated but common responsibilities, which is this code and term for the fact that those countries who are emerging economies or struggling economies and are also not the highest emitting states have different responsibilities than those who are the largest countries and the biggest emitters. And that is taken from a lot of discourse we already know over the past years in international law, but it hasn't been spoken by the International Court of Justice as definitive. And so now we know that those strands of legal argument that really said, you know, US, China, industrialized countries, others who are the biggest emitters have to do much, much more in climate obligations, including assist those other countries who are trying to meet their obligations. And I mentioned things like transfer of climate technology, providing financial assistance, resources, protecting people on the move from these countries, which, you know, people are not just moving for climate. It often interrelates with conflict or with other issues, but climate might be a catalyst for people to move, or it might make moving or staying in place much more difficult because there is a conflict going on and they don't have a lot of ability to adapt. So this is really something that I think we're going to tease out for quite a long time to come. But the legal obligations definitely would not mean Yemen would have to do something in its state much more than, or at the same level even, than the big polluting or emitting countries. And in fact, they should be receiving assistance. They and other countries like them, much more assistance. And there's a lot that the court mentions, taking from human rights doctrine, taking from decisions of the law of the sea, taking from decisions of the climate discussions. And so I think there's a rich array of tools that it provides, it points to.
Uh, if I may add something, may
Yes,
I?
please.
Yeah, I mean, in any case, when we talk about fragile states like Yemen or many countries in Africa, of course, is I mean the first entity that should take responsibility for that is the international community in its entirety, because I mean, countries like Yemen, that was mentioned, but many countries as well, like in Africa. I mean, of course, they suffer a lot for climate change when they produce, when they are not really active actors in producing, pollution. So, of course, in the last resort, there should be the big actors like China, for instance, or India, or the United States. They should take responsibility for what is happening also in the rest of the world, because, I mean, if they are the ones who produce more pollution, they also have the means to try to fight against it. And they cannot pretend that, I don't know, that Ivory Coast or Togo, they have the resources to fight against pollution that is not caused by themselves, actually. So, yeah.
Indeed.
It's what is called, I'm sorry, it's what is called in refugee law the ban on sharing. There is a different concept for refugee law, but I mean, it's a burden what is happening, and it needs to be shared by, above all, by a major actor. Like as refugees, there is a burden sharing, and more developed countries they're trying to, to absorb the most part of refugees worldwide. They should also do the same with pollution. I mean, it's they cannot just leave. They cannot, I mean, being the main active actors in producing pollution and leave countries that they don't have means in, I mean, to fight it. I think it's not even ethical, right? Thank you.
Michelle, I was so struck by your examples of regional countries that are collaborating to address climate mobility and workforce development, and successfully and in collaboratively in ways that benefit both people who are migrating and host countries as well. And I'm really, it seems like at least in the United States, maybe even all over the world, we really need those examples to be trumpeted. People need to know more about alternatives to, um, frankly, the fear mongering and scapegoating and so forth that's taking place now regarding international migration. Do you have any ideas for how those stories can be better told and more heard?
So I so agree with you, Alan. They do need to be trumpeted more. There was a time in the last few years when, in fact, the US government on different levels was, from the Department of Labor to the Department of State, were looking, for instance, at Latin America and how labor mobility partnerships could affect and relieve sort of pressures on some areas that were affected by climate, some populations. And how would you match that? How would you bring people in on a positive way? What kind of visas would you look at? Brazil, for instance, has implemented, it's not necessarily a humanitarian visa, but it's for people who might be displaced by climate to come and have a chance to make a livelihood or enter a particular labor market. So this was starting to unfold, and unfortunately, I think the scope for that discussion in the government right now in the United States is very difficult. I will say that at the local level, state level, and community cities, they're very much looking to see how they can have those positive discussions about how migrants contribute, if they're leaving displaced areas, how they can work together with people in training and providing skills. I think even though federal action might be limited or in some ways shut down on some of these issues, I think at the regional level, certainly in the Caribbean, there is still a lot of discussion about these options as just being so practical and constructive. I think that's why we see this happening in parts of Africa. They're open to this. Now, I'm not trying to say that the countries in IGAD or East Africa or other regions are not kind of at conflict sometimes when it comes to having shared policy, but they're much more open to these discussions. And I think that's because the reality is they're living it. They're living this reality where people do have to move. They have to have outlets, and they want to see how economically that would benefit migrants and the communities and opening and growing their labor markets. And I think that's the key. They understand that growing their labor markets, growing businesses requires that they get the right skills and talents to help business do that. And they want to be prosperous. So that's one way also to build resilience. Those discussions haven't really happened in the United States much, but as we saw with Hurricane Katrina and other people moving internally in the US, some of those discussions are starting to emerge. So tapping on to the positive conversations of cities and those on the front lines could be an opportunity to help move this along until more positive debates happen at the federal level.
Indeed.
Can I add to that?
Please.
it's such a shame that we don't have that over here, because like the success of the PALM program, which is the Pacific Labor Migration, has been just fantastic. Spending time in Vanuatu, I heard from farmers who had learned a lot from working in Australia, and they're developing how they can more easily have access to agricultural development in there, so that they can have new restaurants, for example, and support that with the tourism and all of the cruise ships coming in, and so these programs, especially, I mean, that's more circular migration, but that's the skills for resilience for those who don't want to leave home. So I think regionally, at least on the other side of the world, the success, the comfort, of knowing that these are your neighbors, it's much more friendly than anything that we're seeing here. So the success stories exist. I just think they're sort of out of the echo chamber over here.
And yet the research is that when immigrants come in, they increase job opportunities and wealth for Native people. They start more businesses. They are much less likely to be criminals. I mean, in short, it's a huge benefit, especially now when we're talking about the West facing long-term population decline. I'm going to be retiring eventually, and we need to do something about that. Okay, never mind. That was a completely unnecessary remark. I don't mean to drag us down into the personal, but what a very fine set of papers, and how nice to have such a global perspective and to be thinking about these things from the perspective of different regions, people in different, very different kinds of settings, and to realize how much common humanity we have as a basis for what we really need to figure out. How do we move forward? I think that runs our time out pretty much. So once more, a thank you to Andrea, Carol, Cristiano, and Michelle, and a thank you to our organizers for this symposium. And I hope to see more of you at
Yes,
different future
okay.
sessions.
Yeah, sorry, can I add one last reflection?
Would you please add one last thing, Cristiano?
Yeah, no, the maybe can be of interest because in always talking about Africa, actually we are waiting for an advisory opinion on climate change by the African Court that has been requested in May, and visibly it should be out most probably during this month of November.
You've muted yourself.
Sorry, yes, sorry. So yeah. No, I mean, so possibly for people who are interested in climate change and displacement, or I mean, we would be interested to follow what will happen now in this month, because, as I said, in the second half of the month, we are waiting for the advisory opinion by the African Court on climate change in Africa, in fact. That's this information.
I bet it will add to the international law that we need, don't you think? All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and I'll see you in a future session, and perhaps after that.
Thanks so much, Alan.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.